Okay, in this video tutorial we're going to talk about how microorganisms can be used to help us make certain foods. So the first one we're going to look at is bread. So you've all probably eaten bread, and this uses yeast as the key microorganism that's used generally to make bread. So bread, remember yeast is a fungus or a fungi. And it's mixed in with the flour and with water, and it's the yeast that causes the bread to rise. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why it actually rises. Essentially what happens is the yeast feeds on generally sugar, often glucose, or it could be some other sugar, but generally feeds on sugar within the bread, and it turns this into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And this is a type of anaerobic respiration, so that's respiration without oxygen. So the term respiration means to obtain energy from food, essentially is probably the quickest explanation I can give here. I will do a video on all about respiration itself, so maybe watch that if you want more information. But essentially we use what's called aerobic respiration. We use oxygen to release the energy stored in energy-rich molecules such as our food or our fat stored in our body. Whereas some organisms can actually do this without oxygen. So yeast is an example of that. Yeast breaks down glucose in the bread, and that produces carbon dioxide, ethanol, which is the chemical name for alcohol, for what we would normally call alcohol, and energy. So this is the energy the yeast needs to grow and function. And the reason this is useful for us is the carbon dioxide is released as small bubbles, and those bubbles are what cause it gets trapped in the dough as small bubbles, and that's what causes the bread to rise and gives it that nice light airy texture. The alcohol simply evaporates, and that's why you probably haven't heard anyone getting drunk off eating bread. But anyway, so yeast is a core or an essential element in making bread, because the carbon dioxide that's produced causes the bread to rise. Now some other things like cakes and things like that, the alternative is to use baking soda, because often when that's heated that will release carbon dioxide too. But the traditional way, and the way that's still used in most breads, is to add yeast, and that's often why you have to leave the bread to rise a little bit before it's baked as well. And the yeast essentially start to feed on that sugar and produce that carbon dioxide, and that adds sort of air bubbles within the bread, get trapped in the bread, and gives it that nice airy texture. So bread wouldn't be possible without our helpful fungi yeast. Alright, so beer. Beer is another good example, and some wine or champagne wine and champagne are other examples. Beer is made from barley seeds, so wine rather than being made from barley seeds is made from grapes. You probably knew that. But these things are essentially just a source of sugar or carbohydrate for the yeast to feed on. So essentially the barley seeds contain starch, and the seeds are dampened to sort of encourage germination, and that makes enzymes which start to break the starch down into sugar. So essentially the barley seeds are a source of sugar. This is then dried into malt, which is ground up and added to water, boiled and filtered. Hops, which are part of the special flour, are added basically just to add flavor to the beer. So yeast is then added, and again, so we're talking about yeast again, a fungus or fungi carries out anaerobic respiration, and that's why beer and wine have to be produced in barrels traditionally, or these days sometimes metal vats, like big metal containers, and that's to keep out any oxygen, because if oxygen is present, they won't actually produce the alcohol. So yeast is added, and it carries out anaerobic respiration or fermentation, which is without oxygen, and again it breaks down the glucose either from the barley or from the barley or malt, or from the grapes. So it breaks down sugars from the barley or the grapes, and again produces carbon dioxide and alcohol and energy for the yeast to grow. So the alcohol is essentially what gives alcoholic beverages their sort of unique flavour, and the carbon dioxide, if that's not released, so in wine generally it's released. There's kind of a pressure valve, so it escapes. But if you trap that in the container, it'll be quite fizzy, and so that carbon dioxide is what gives beer and champagne and those sorts of beverages their bubbles. So yeast actually gives alcoholic beverages not only their alcohol content, but also can give them their bubbles. Yogurt. So yogurt is made by adding a starter culture to warm milk. And a starter culture consists of a special group of bacteria, often referred to as lactic acid bacteria or lactobacilli, because they're usually rod-shaped. So that bacilli tells you they're rod-shaped. And so these are harmless bacteria. They don't actually cause us any harm. In a similar way, the yeast used in bread, it doesn't do us any damage either, any harm. And a lot of microorganisms really are actually quite good for us. So making yogurt usually involves adding a small starter culture, which is a small amount of these bacteria to milk. And the reason ideally you want to add a starter culture is you can actually just use bacteria from around the room. So, in theory you could get a bit of milk and just dip your finger in it, and whatever bacteria were on your finger will be in the milk, and they'll help turn it into yogurt for you. The dangerous aspect with that is if there are some nasty bacteria happen to be on your finger, they'll grow in the yogurt as well, and then obviously you'll get some nasty bugs, or it might make you sick. So what you want to do is get a starter culture, and that's usually basically all you need to do is get some yogurt that you know is safe, that tasted all right and didn't make anyone sick. And you take a spoonful of that, a decent spoonful of that, and that's your starter culture, because it hasn't made anyone sick, it did its job, so it contains lots of those good bacteria, these lactic acid bacteria, and you use those as a starter culture. You add them to warm milk and they'll grow in there. And it also helps ensure that even if some bad bacteria get in there, they don't really have much chance competing against the thousands of good bacteria that you've put in there in your starter culture. Although there is always the risk, so you want to be quite hygienic when you're doing these kind of things to try and reduce the chance of bad bacteria getting in there. So these lactic acid bacteria, or lactobacilli, carry out anaerobic respiration, or fermentation again, and they convert lactose. Lactose is a sugar, so here technically it should say lactose rather than glucose. They convert lactose, which is a slightly different type of sugar, into lactic acid, and that also releases some energy for the bacteria to live and function. And it's this lactic acid that actually gives yogurt its sourness. So if you try natural sort of unsweetened yogurt that hasn't had a ton of sugar added to it, it's got quite a sour taste to it. That's the lactic acid from these bacteria. That acid also causes proteins in the milk to precipitate, which basically means they sort of start to lump together, and they essentially, rather than being soluble, dissolved in the liquid milk, they come out, thicken, sort of lump together as a solid, and so that's what causes the milk to thicken. So this lactic acid causes the milk proteins to precipitate, which makes the milk thicken, and that's what gives yogurt its texture. So the lactic acid is what makes the yogurt thicken and gives it its sour taste. Cheese, one of my favourite foods. So making cheese also depends on these lactic acid bacteria, or lactobacilli. They're naturally found in milk, and they're what make milk go sour. So if you leave milk in the fridge for long enough, it usually goes sour. And so these bacteria can be added, again, to change that sugar in milk, that lactose, so again this should really say lactose here, lactose sugar, into lactic acid and energy. So that's the energy they use to live and grow. And again, this is an anaerobic respiration. So this is usually done sort of in a salty water kind of mixture, in a brine, or the cheese is covered in a wax. And these all help to prevent oxygen coming in contact with it. So the lactic acid makes the milk curdle, and that's essentially causing those proteins to precipitate again, as we mentioned for yogurt. So the lactic acid causes the proteins to, normally they're dissolved in the milk, they sort of start to form a solid, they sort of start to stick together and form a solid, making the milk curdle or thicken. So what's added then is an enzyme, and it actually usually comes from the stomach of calves, called renin. And this breaks down the proteins in the milk, which kind of helps them further sort of form a solid, and that solid's called the curd. So when milk curdles, especially once renin is added, it'll start to separate into a solid, which we call the curd, and a liquid, which is called whey, and that's spelt W-H-E-Y, so whey. And you may have heard of the nursery rhyme, Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. So that's the milk that's split or separated into the solid part, the curd, and the whey, the liquid. So the liquid is usually just drained off, and then the curd, the solid part, which basically contains all the protein from the milk and the fat. And then that's essentially often squashed to squeeze out some of the liquid, and then it's allowed to ripen. And this is often, they use molds and yeasts, so fungi, to help ripen that cheese. So they allow those to grow on the outside of the cheese. You can also often see mold in blue vein cheese as a mold that's actually been sort of injected into the cheese and causes the blue veins throughout the cheese. So if you're a fan of blue cheese like I am, again, it gives it that really sour, sharp taste as the mold growing through within the cheese. But if you're a fan of brie or camembert, that's actually ripened with a mold that grows on the outside of the cheese. So there's the white stuff on the outside is I believe, a combination of mold and wax. It's been covered in wax often too. So again, molds and yeasts can be important in the cheese making process and make some really excellent cheeses that have some really nice flavors to them. So again, bacteria, key process, key part of making cheese, making that milk thicken or curdle, and it's the curd that's pressed and then ripened to make cheese. And molds and yeasts are sometimes used to allowed to grow on the cheese to give it that bit of extra kick. Cool, so I hope you found that helpful. I think the key idea here is that in the food making process, it's often the anaerobic respiration, the growth without oxygen, that's really important to these foods, as well as it's a special types of microorganisms. And it's worth noting here that not all microorganisms are bad. Some of them are really good and do really helpful things for us and help us make valuable products and even foods. So obviously all the ones that are mentioned here are safe to eat because they're in these foods and we eat them all the time. And I've said that before, that actually there are more bacterial cells in our body than there are actually human cells. So they can't all be bad. And in fact, we need some of those to survive and to live a healthy life. So these are a few more examples of how bacteria are actually really good and helpful to us. Cool, I hope you found that helpful.